Well, Dan is a tough act to follow too, after all of these different speakers this week. So it is my pleasure to be here. They told you that I am now working for Kansas State University. I also am I have had a farm now for 2 years. So I actually have skin in the game when it comes to food production. Dan asked me to talk about climate and food production. And so I am a full-fledged farmer. How many farmers do we have in the room today? Raise your hands. Okay. How many people grew up on a farm? All right, a few more. How many people had a grandparent that farmed? Awesome. So there is some connection. Unfortunately, in the United States, there's about 2% of the people that farm now. And of those 2%, of the people in the room, there's a lot of people that are more than 3 generations removed from agriculture. So your customers are asking you, where does my food come from? Who's producing my food? We want to know. We want more transparency. Farmers know that they need to be more transparent, but these conversations are sometimes difficult. There's a lot of different ways to farm. I remember when in food service, when we started eliminating the walls and cooking in front of everyone, it wasn't that we had anything to hide, but it was just a little bit different. So farmers have a lot of great sustainability stories to share, but they don't always use the same language. So today I want to give you an insight into what I call conventionally raised agriculture, which is what most of your food and how it is raised. My farm is in the middle of the United States in Marysville, Kansas. So someone told me today that NPR and that the news had a big article that said farming has to change because of global warming. I thought that's great because it's been changing. It's been changing ever since I've heard the stories from my family. This piece of equipment is a dump rake. For those of you that don't know, it's the first piece of equipment that my dad operated. You sit on it and a horse pulled it, and when the hay got underneath it, you pulled the lever and you had a way to make a hay bale. So that's sitting in my yard now because it has some sentimental meaning to me. But back in the day, they could feed 1 to 2 families with farming that way. They had the big dust bowls. They had a lot of things that happened. 1942, this is my grandpa. He's now transitioned from horse equipment to tractors, can get a lot more work done. He's actually cutting wheat with this process. The way they did wheat back in the 40s was you would take a plow after the wheat was cut, and you would plow up the soil, you would use cultivating equipment, and then you would plant the crop in the ground. All of that tears up what we've learned now is those methods are not as sustainable as some of the new methods. Here's my dad in the 70s and 80s. I used to help him a lot on those acres. He fed 72 people. It's getting a little bit harder to make a connection with your family farmer because they're now getting bigger. This is my brother, 2019. He's my partner in my farm now. He went to college. He learned how to farm. He brought back a lot of new methods to the farm and to the process. Now, a farmer feeds around 165 people, one farmer, 2% of the population. It takes a lot of different kinds of equipment. This equipment costs a lot of money, so it's got a lot more investment than some of my predecessors. So we talk about climate change, and the funny thing is, my whole life revolved around, has it rained? Since I've been here at the conference, I know in the last 24 hours that my farm got 53/100ths of an inch of rain, which was a good thing. That means I don't have to run my irrigation pivot this week. So we live with the rain. We pray for it to stop, we pray for it to start, and it controls my social life. So sometimes if you're trying to get a crop in, you may have to work really late into the night. You may have to make shifts. Maybe we're not going to plant this crop now. We're going to hold off until the weather's better. It's very impressive on how, and I kind of forgot about that till I moved back home, how much the weather does impact what goes on. Whoops. So I'm going to give you a little aerial view of what I look at every day. Keep moving. This is The intent of this slide was to give you a view of what a modern farm looks like, an average modern farm. This farm has soybeans planted here. If you go around, there's a lot of corn that you would see. On the other direction, you would see a pasture where we have cattle and where we have ground that really shouldn't be farmed because it's very rocky and hilly. Oh, here we go. Yay. Okay, so this is looking out north of the house. Some of these crops that are growing, my dad was never able to grow. We never had corn in Kansas on Upland Farm because we didn't get enough rain. So now we have huge fields of corn. We have huge fields of soybeans. My dad didn't raise soybeans because we couldn't control the weeds. But with different processes now, I'll show you how we can do that. Looking to the south here is the pasture where the cows are. And again, we don't cultivate that for growing crops, but it grows pasture, and so the cows graze there. We have some animal handling facilities that are different from my dad. It causes less stress on the animals as we transport them and as we work with them and as we make their lives better. This is my drone, I guess, is what it was. So, anyway, we have some on-farm storage, and again, we're back to the beginning. So let's talk a little bit about how those soybeans are raised and why we can raise them now and we couldn't raise them when my dad was farming. So we call it no-till. And I thought that was a term that maybe everybody knew, but in practicing my talk on Mary Angela Miller, she didn't know what it meant. So we had to go back to ground zero. No-till in my world means that we are not disturbing the soil anymore. We're able to actually plant directly into a crop that was grown the year before. Whenever you tear up soil, carbon is released. And as Dan talked about, that's what we want to avoid. We want to avoid those carbon emissions in the environment. So in this process, you might see a little bit of waste in the field. There's some corn cobs laying there. Last year, this field was corn. We turned the cattle in it last fall. They ate all the residue. They cleaned up all the corn that was left over. And then they actually did natural fertilization of the land. And then this spring, we planted soybeans directly into that ground. So there's a lot of reasons why that is a lot more sustainable. It's because you have less erosion, it retains moisture, you put more organic material back into your ground. So now we have a term that I've heard called regenerative agriculture. My parents called it soil conservation, but this is a method where we're also raising soybeans, but after the corn was cut, we actually took an airplane and flew over and dropped ryegrass. So we got lucky and it rained, so the ryegrass grew. We put the cattle in it, so now the cattle, they ate the corn stalks and the corn residue, but they also ate the ryegrass. So we left them in there till winter time. We pulled them out, got them closer to the barn so we could take care of them and feed them, because in Kansas we don't grow grass all year long. And then the next spring, we planted the soybeans. So this is kind of an experiment. This is kind of new processes in my part of the country. There was a little bit of concern because it was such a wet spring that seed would germinate. It almost acted like a mulch, but we got lucky. The sun came out and the soybeans grew. These soybeans are actually a little bit smaller than the ones that were grown without cover crop. But if the weather stays warm and hot, if it turns hot, these will probably do better because they have more moisture. Weeds are the nemesis of a farmer. Less weeds means we have to use less herbicide. We also have a lot of technology in farming today. This is a picture of the inside of a tractor. There's GPS technology there where it's hooked up to a plotted field where we took soil samples of the farm every 4 acres, and we plug it into the GPS. And so now when we're putting fertilizer and chemicals on the ground, we can be very precise and very exact as to how much goes on the field, as opposed to just having one recipe where every acre gets the same. So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about climate and animals, which is what I'm working in now at K-State. And when I went to K-State, I said, wow, all my customers, when I was in sales, they want to buy local and they want to buy their animals. Some of them have criteria in their purchasing guides where they want to buy within 250 miles. And his comment was, what would you want to do that for? He says, that's not a very good place to raise cattle. So if you look at this picture, this is from May, June, and July of this year. And the places where it's orange is where there's a lot more stress on cattle. So those are really humid parts of the country. And one of the things that cattle have a hard time with is respiratory disease. They call it BRD, lots of research on that. So when it's hot and humid, they tend to get more respiratory disease, they have more issues. And what does that cause? That causes more health issues, potentially more antibiotic treatment. So it's better for the animal to be moved to where it's more arid. This is something that I introduced on the farm, I'm very proud of. I was doing some work in the feedlot, and I said, how come there's no flies in this feedlot? There's 50,000 animals, and there's manure. Seems like there ought to be some flies. And so what I learned was they get this coolest thing. They get this package of wasps every month, and these wasps are mailed to you, and you wait till they start to hatch, and then you place them strategically along your farm, and they eat the fly eggs before they're hatched. So I tried it this year because these are my prize mules. Anything I can do to make their life better, I'm going to do. These mules, now I don't have to use as much fly spray, and they're a lot more comfortable. But we're doing it naturally without chemicals. So the farm is a classroom. How do we go home and convince people to change their farming methods? They've been farming this way for a long time. So there's a lot of research going on right now. There's a lot of change. Like Dan said, there's a lot of reasons why we need to change. But some of those habits and some of those processes take years. So as we know, nutrition and ag is kind of an evolving science. There's a trend right now to replace beef with something else. And as we look at some of the things that have happened, at least in my career, we found that cholesterol really isn't the nemesis of heart disease. So I would just be cautious as we look to some of these changes that are being recommended. Are they really going to improve climate change? And there's a lot of research that's contradictory at this moment. So in our operation, I believe cattle are part of the solution. They help us utilize our waste. They take something that I can't eat and they turn it into something that has a high biological value protein to it. In the United States, we are very efficient with how we do these methods, but that's not the way everyone farms globally. When we look at carbon footprint, I have to tell you, I have looked at the numbers several different ways, and who knows more about benchmarking than the people in this room? If you're gonna benchmark my food costs, by God, I wanna know what numbers you're using. And we know in our own operations, we may have a hospital, we may have 10 hospitals in our system, and we may do it differently in each, we may count a little bit differently in each one. Maybe that doesn't happen anymore, but it did to me. But anyway, when you start comparing numbers in countries that don't collect a lot of data, like India and China and Brazil, there's a lot of numbers that are not always the same. In the United States, we are very efficient. We have a lot different numbers, and so as you look at numbers, think about the global number versus the United States. So this is my new project. It's the new farm. My brother and I we're in on this. So it has a river that goes through it. And so it creates a lot of opportunities as well as challenges. My brother farmed the part that's in the top. He's farmed that for 10 years. That's what we call river bottom farm ground, very prized property in Kansas. Not a lot of irrigation in Kansas. So I bought the part from that middle part down. And for all these years, my brother has watched the soil run off of his place, and it runs down that gully and runs in the river. That place where the circle is, that was big enough to put 2 dump trucks in there. It was a huge hole, and all the soil was running off. So we knew we wanted to fix that. So we got lucky, and over to the right there, they were tearing down an elevator over at the co-op, and we took 100 dump trucks full of rocks and cement and dumped in that hole. And the result was the picture on the left, which is we were able to retain a lot of the dirt that was trying to run into the river. So we've got a process going. We're not perfect yet, but we're getting there. A longer term plan would be to put a buffer strip that would help filter out the nitrogen that we put on our crop ground. But I would have to take acres out of my production, which would dip into my yield. And if everything goes right, I'm going to have this farm paid off when I'm 78 years old, so I don't have a lot of room for error. But there are government programs that can help me, and I think I might be able to qualify for a buffer strip. We also added irrigation, which helps us with climate change. We can sprinkle a little water on it now. if it turns dry. This is the fun time about farming. This was the second year of having my farm. We were cutting corn down there. I was nervous because some of the corn was missing the combine and it was laying in the field. And I had a four-wheeler and I was trying to pick it up and put it in a bucket. My brother's like, really? He goes, don't worry about it. He goes, the cattle are going to come by and the cattle are going to eat the leftover corn. We have deer, we have turkeys. It's going to help support the wildlife. So don't worry about your little bit of corn dropping off. Okay. So this is the fourth generation. This is my daughter, Rose. I don't know if she's going to be a farmer. All I know is that land is a finite commodity here in the world. There's only so much of it. So I had the opportunity to invest. And so I took that opportunity and did it. So back to you guys. Who should you buy from? You know, I've heard some wonderful stories while I've been here, individual agreements that you have with local people, regional people, and I think that's fabulous. If you want to do business with me, I like you a lot, but I don't know how we're going to work that out unless we take advantage of the other parts of the industry. So I was lucky enough to work in manufacturing distribution and know some of the people on that side. There are some really smart people that can really help us connect. When you have your list of criteria that you want to buy for your customers, work with the system that can offer leverage and get some answers for you, because working with you pay your distributors, your procurement teams, your GPOs, your manufacturers, they have the relationships with the farmers like my brother and me. So hopefully I've given you a little bit of insight today. A lot of the things that we're doing on the farm are invisible to the naked eye. How do you know that we're doing cover crops? How do you know about all these processes that are improving erosion and making the soil more nutritious? It's very difficult. So hopefully we've had a little bit of insight into that. As we talk about footprint, this is my dad, I don't know if buying this farm was really the best financial decision I've ever made in my life, but I can tell you that sometimes people farm for other reasons than that. It's a lifestyle. So I wanted to share that with you today. Thank you.